It is my joy to introduce and welcome Dr. Bryan Stone from Boston University School of Theology. At the School of Theology, he is the E. Stanley Jones Professor of Evangelism and has been since 1998. He is also the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and is the co-director for the Center of Practical Theology. He has authored numerous articles and books. Some of his more recent books include, in 2012, A Reader in Ecclesiology, and in 2007, Evangelism After Christendom, Theology and Practice of Christian Witness. And last month, it came out in the BU Today, his point of view of all those Bible films that are coming out, and he wrote an article in response to them, weighing the positives and the negatives of all those Bible films. And I appreciate his viewpoints on both. That has helped in my dialogue about all those Bible films. The title is, Do We Really Need Another Bible Film? And as a former student, I had the opportunity, the privilege of taking two of his classes, his evangelism class and his class on faith and film, teaching still of which I use today. And talking to former students, classmates of mine, they would describe Dr. Stone with these words. He is provocative, he asks tough questions, he challenges students to think about church in alternative ways, and he has this ability to discuss or argue both sides of any theological position, and while you struggle with that discussion or his viewpoints on both sides, you end up learning something, and those learnings I still use today. Today we are the first conference to hear about some of his research or his new nationwide research project, still very much in process, but we are the first conference to hear those learnings, those researches today. So why don't you join me in welcoming Dr. Bryan Stone here.
Today, as Heather said, in the first session, I want to present some research that we've been doing at the School of Theology for the last well over a year. We started the nationwide phase of it this year, but we did a pilot study last year using Boston, St. Louis, and Los Angeles, and learned a lot of things from that pilot study that made us change the questionnaire and refocus some things. About 20 years ago, over 20 years ago, Bishop John Finney in the United Kingdom did a study called Finding Faith Today, where he looked at how people come to faith, what were the key influences, what actually changed when they came to faith. And for some time now, I've been wanting to do that here in the United States as a follow-up, asking many of the same questions to see if there were differences 20 years later, and if there were differences accounting for the difference from the UK context to the US context. And so we finally were able to get this started last year. Now, it's been a very interesting task in the United States is how do you get people to take the survey, people who newly come to faith. He was the bishop in the UK, so he had a lot more clout than I did. He could just tell his clergy, please pass out this survey. I have no such clout. So last year in the pilot study, we sent out a survey. We asked pastors to do it first, to talk about what was going on in their church. Then we asked them to hand it out or give them the link to the survey if they had people who had come to faith recently. We found that it really got bogged down. Once you asked the pastors to take a survey, that already slowed things down, and then having to ask them to pass it along. So in the nationwide, we still have to go through the clergy to get to these people, but we're not asking the clergy to take a survey this time. And to go back to that, that is the web link, if you want to look at it, if you ever want to go to it. And some of you may have already participated in it. I think we've done some Pennsylvania churches already. But this will actually, ours will be different from the UK version in the sense that we're also going to do an interfaith component. Right now we're still in the Christian phase, which is the largest one, but we'll be also looking at how Buddhists come to faith, Jews, Muslims, etc., and then trying to make some comparative judgments about that. We're at about the 2/3 point where we need to be on the Christian. So I'm stopping midstream and showing you what we've learned so far. A lot of this will be more statistical, but there's a lot more qualitative data. We've been doing a lot of phone calls. There are a lot of answers that are written out, not just data in terms of numerical counts. But I think you'll find it fascinating. Some of the stuff that we're learning is obvious, and some stuff is rather surprising. If you are interested in taking this or in passing the link along, you can go to the website and it'll tell you, basically we're looking for people who are 18 years or older and who've come to faith since 2011, January 1, 2011. So relatively new. It could be that they returned to faith. Maybe they made a decision early on in life and then left faith and then came back. That counts too. But just people who've just changed churches would not count in that kind of thing, which is a lot of people, of course. The population that we're getting so far, in the surveys, is pretty much parallels the U.S. population in terms of the age. You can see the breakdown here on this chart. It doesn't look too different from the respondents over here of the survey compared to the U.S. population in 2012 in terms of the breakdown of age. So that's a good thing. The educational attainment, though, is very different. We're getting a much more educated group of people responding to the survey than is the actual U.S. population. So we're having to make some shifts because of that. It stands to reason, and most researchers know, that more highly educated people are probably going to respond to surveys. However, this is really quite astounding when you think about it. In the United States, this is just the opposite. I'm glad to try this out on you. Only 10% of the population have an advanced degree. So this is wrong. This is not this respondents. These should just be switched. Only 10% of the U.S. population has an advanced degree beyond a college degree, whereas 43% of our respondents do. That's really something when you think about it. It's really quite amazing. So you add everybody in here who has a college degree or more, you get like 76%. 3/4 of our respondents have a college degree or more, whereas that's only 28% in the United States. So you have to count for that difference when you're looking at things, and that may make a real difference. However, as we've parsed things out and looked at people with different educational levels, we haven't seen that much of a difference in most factors in terms of how people say they come to faith. Ethnicity is also a problem in the way we're getting respondents. So in the United States, you would expect to have 13% African American or black, 5% Asian, 4% other, and we only have 3% other, 2% Asian, and 4% black or African American. So we're in a phase right now where our researchers are calling ethnic minority churches and trying to get pastors to do this. Responses to emails are not as good there, and so phone calls are working much better. So we hope to address that and as we make changes. Then this is the response by the different populations, and primarily most of the data we're breaking down into three categories: evangelicals, mainline, and Roman Catholic Orthodox. There aren't that many responses from Eastern Orthodox churches, so then they're not very different from Roman Catholic in how they respond, so we lump them together. You can see already that we're getting a lot more responses from mainline congregations, people who've come to faith in the mainline church. So 22% of U.S. Christians are mainline, but 48% of our respondents are mainline. What is it with mainline Christians? They love filling out surveys, I guess. Methodists are like, I think they're like 10% when they're only, they're 5% of the U.S. Christian population there. So Methodists really love surveys. Episcopalians crave surveys. They're like 2% of the population, but they're like 20% of our population. I don't know why Episcopalians are filling these out. We have 8% that we don't know that didn't say what they are, and we guess largely that they're evangelicals, non-denomination. So probably the evangelical population is higher than the 19% that we say we have here. How do people actually declare that they've made a new declaration of faith, or how do they say they've come to faith? This is not how they came to faith. This is how they declared it in some way. We have to find some way of getting to these people, so this is what we have asked, is how they signaled it. For mainline Protestants, membership, over half declare that through some sort of membership. You get 19% that are baptized, 14% confirmation, and 15% should be other. That's not incorrect on the RCIA. RCIA is the Roman Catholic Initiation of Adults. So that's not going to be evangelical Protestants and Catholic. I've got to fix these charts. But what you do find is with Roman Catholic, so that the colors are off, but this 45% of Roman Catholic are going through a Roman Catholic initiation of adults class. And this is they're actually quite good at making this a marker for having people be introduced into the faith. Evangelicals do a lot of membership also, and a lot of baptism, as you can see. 40% of evangelicals signal it through baptism. Instructional classes. Did they take a class when they decided to make a decision to come to faith? 95% of Catholics do. As I mentioned, they're very effective with this Roman Catholic initiation of adults. Mainline Protestants, 72% take some sort of class, and evangelicals, 63%, so fewer. But still, most new Christians are taking some kind of initiation class or some sort of instructional class as they become a Christian. And of the people who actually did take a class, 95% of them found it helpful. So instructional classes are really working very well, at least as self-reported by the new Christians. What about their family's attitude? 60% of people who come to faith claim that their family's attitude towards Christianity was either very positive or quite positive, and that's not surprising. The neutral is a little bit smaller than the 36% in the UK study. What we found is that in the US, people tend to be a little bit more polarized than they were in the UK. I'm not sure why that is, but their family background was either more hostile or very positive. I think that just has to do with still that a population which still experiences a lot of Christianity and has feelings about it one way or the other in the US. What about their involvement in any organizations that were attached to the church during their youth? Over half went to some sort of religious training, Sunday school, sometime in their youth. Youth group, 43%. And then the next highest is some sort of religious school. And those mostly fall in the Roman Catholic camp. So these are all everybody together. Have you ever made a profession of faith prior to the one that you're making now, we asked. And the highest group is the mainline. Mainline Christians this is kind of interesting, I don't know quite how to account for it, you might, why 3/4 of them had actually made an earlier decision of faith and then either lapsed and came back. Well, that would be the reason. So you see that a lot in mainline churches, people coming back to the faith? Because this is what we see nationwide anyway. I don't know if you see it in your regions. Evangelicals, less so, 53% had made a prior decision, and Roman Catholics even less so, 43%, which means they probably grew up and have thought of themselves as Christian all along, or at least Catholic. Now, this is a pretty complex chart, but I think I can help you make sense of it quickly. Let's do the non-evangelicals, which would include you all, mainline and Roman Catholic. 69% of non-evangelicals have always understood themselves to be Christian all their life. They have made a recent declaration of faith in which they have sort of owned up to it or understand themselves as to be taking it more seriously. But 69% have always thought that, and only 31% are aware of a time when they weren't Christian. That's very different. Well, yeah, it is different. It's completely reversed when you get to evangelicals. Evangelicals, only 30% have thought of themselves as always Christian. And so you got far more, 70%, who this is their first time to be Christian. That's interesting in itself, too. Of those who were aware of a time when they weren't Christian among mainlines, it's about half and half. Some are the first time, and some are returnees. A little bit, way more first-timers when you get to evangelicals. In every case, those who have thought of themselves as always Christian all their life, most of them, the vast majority, 92 and 93%, understand themselves to have been less committed at least. That's why they've made this declaration of faith. This is probably one of the most important features of the study so far, which is whether people come to faith gradually or suddenly. And as you can see, it's 72% gradual for evangelicals and 90% gradual for mainline and Roman Catholics. That probably fits your experience too, I would think. You probably get some people who suddenly come to faith, but the vast majority of people we're seeing in the United States come to faith gradually. In the red here in this chart means that was the UK study 20 years ago. And so it's increased. Evangelicals have increased in the U.S., are 72% versus the 63% in the UK, and 90% versus the 80%. This is incorrect. That's 80%. It's the same as the UK. Please correct that if you're writing down things. So 80% is same as UK, but we're higher with the evangelicals. So evangelicals are more gradual than in the UK. Yeah. Of those who knew of a time, now you can also break it down by those who knew of a time when they were Christian before or those who didn't. And those who knew of a time when they were not Christian, that also is pretty high, 54%, but not as high as in the UK. And it's exactly the same for those who have always described themselves. You would expect that they would think of the Christian journey as more gradual and taking time. Now, what I love looking at in this chart is if you ask them to single out one, the major influence for them coming to faith, what is it? And we also divide this by male and female because there are stark differences sometimes between males and females in terms of the number one influence. For mainline Christians, a congregation is their number one influence, the number one thing that influences them. Congregation was not even on the list that John Finney used in the UK. He had all these other choices but didn't have congregation. We added that because from the very beginning, I've suspected that the congregation was important. I feel really vindicated in this. By putting that on the chart, and it shows up at number one, that really means something to me. A minister was second highest, though it's higher for males than females. A spouse is very important. It's interesting, the spouse is more important for males in the mainline and Roman Catholic churches. Well, it is across the board, but less so for evangelicals. Scripture was then, and friends, religious activities, your own children, parents, other, literature, drama, a particular person. This is not clergy, they're not friends, just some other person. So you'd expect that to be a little bit low. A dream or a vision, which actually was higher with Roman Catholics. Other family. The lowest one of all is television or radio. So for all the vaunted wonders and success of televangelism, people don't list televangelism as the number one thing almost at all. Or an evangelistic event. Whatever success rallies, crusades, other sorts of evangelistic revivals had in a previous era, they aren't listed now as the number one reason why people come to faith. This is just the number one reason. Now you'll also notice that for evangelicals, Scripture is way off the chart for males. I guess I can understand that, but it was really quite a surprise to see how much that was. And a spouse was also very important for Roman Catholic too. So congregation is not the highest in everyone, but it's up there. Then when you ask them not to just list the number one, but all the main factors that they thought were important. So they could list 2 or 3 or 4. This is what you get. And still, congregation's very high. The spouse and partner is still very high. But interestingly, for evangelicals, the female it lists the influence more than the male. So women in evangelicalism care more about their husband, what their husbands take the lead or influence them, whereas in mainline and Orthodox and Catholic, the male looks to the female. It's kind of interesting how that's playing out. Also, when you read their remarks, this comes out too. Minister, still very important. So the top 3 reasons, the top 3 influences are a congregation, a minister, and a spouse across the United States. Scripture still has a respectable showing. Religious activities still have to have a respectable showing, especially among evangelicals where religious activities show up a little bit higher. Friends, have a very respectable showing also, especially among evangelicalism, but even across the board. What was said in at least our devotional that we had before, you won't have heard that in the simulcast, about relationships from Reverend Faust, is exactly right. It's relationships across the board. This is how people come to faith. And we see that over and over in the statistics and in their remarks. What was the most important feature of a congregation? Well, for mainline Christians, it's the welcome they receive in a congregation. It's not the preaching, it's not the worship, it's the welcome. And that's true with Roman Catholic and Orthodox as well. Evangelicals highlight the preaching, however. I mean, that's a huge difference, this red block here. So evangelicals value preaching, at least I shouldn't say that they value it more than others, but they certainly see it as the most important feature for their coming to that congregation or their coming to faith. I think that's important for us also. Worship still is very, very important in all of the mainline and Orthodox traditions, and preaching has a respectable showing too. Education or small groups is smaller, but it has still a larger showing in the mainline congregations, and social outreach has a larger showing in mainline congregations. You'd expect that to be very important. People are looking for that. Were they an active seeker, or were they sort of drawn in by other people? That's the next question we looked at. And I actually was very surprised at this. I thought that more people would be drawn in, perhaps sort of sucked in maybe, but in fact, we still are very much a nation of seekers. People understand themselves at least that way. 88% of Roman Catholics, 83% of mainline, 74% of evangelicals understand that they were either somewhat or very much a seeker when they came to faith. And you can see that not so much or not at all is very small in these. Whereas drawn in by others, you have a lower number, and they're actually about equal in terms of how that works out. So that's fascinating to me. And you see that borne out. People are very much consciously looking when they come to faith. Now, what sort of changes in social issues actually accompany the coming to faith in the United States? I'm not going to list everything because we had so many things, but these were the ones where we saw the biggest changes in social issues. The light blue would mean that they already, the light blue would mean they were already opposed and they became more opposed. The dark blue means that they became opposed, so they actually had a shift. So the darker ones, the darker blocks are actually probably the more interesting ones in the sense that someone actually made a change. Although the whole thing is actually very important because they're still making shifts. So for the right to an abortion, not surprisingly, I suppose, almost 40% of evangelicals and right at 40% of Roman Catholics either became more opposed or became opposed to a right to abortion. That was probably one of the largest changes right there. Gay marriage, evangelicals and Roman Catholics became more opposed or became opposed in the dark blue, whereas mainline, just the opposite. That's not surprising as well, I suppose, that the vast majority of mainline Christians became more supportive, and actually a good chunk actually became supportive of gay marriage when they came to faith, or as they've come to faith. Gun control, more supportive, evangelicals and mainline, more supportive of gun control. Women's equality, all three traditions became more supportive of women's equality. Less so with Roman Catholic in terms of actually a change, but those who were already supportive. Okay. It's interesting, evangelicals, a large chunk here became supportive of women's equality. Racial justice. Now, you can't really tell everything from these statistics. There are lies, damn lies, and statistics. What you can tell, because you can't tell how they already are, all you can tell here is the shifts, the changes. It could be that a lot of them already supportive. But with racial justice, evangelicals became more supportive if they were already supportive of racial justice. Roman Catholics, no one really became supportive of racial justice, but some became more. And then mainline Christians became more supportive. Economic justice for the poor, evangelicals became way more supportive. And some, a big block, became supportive. They weren't supportive before. Care for the natural environment, all three traditions for economic justice. What actually changed, not now social issues, but how do you describe the change that's going on when you become a Christian across the United States? We asked them to choose on a scale of 0 to 5, what changed the most? Beliefs, their actions or their lifestyle, spiritual practices, prayer, worship, devotionals, their relations with others, whether they're happier than before or whether they're more hopeful than from before. Beliefs, and by the way, these may not look like big differences here, but because of a scale of 0 to 5 and the number of people, almost now 376 respondents. I didn't say that at the beginning. These little ticks are actually quite big in terms of the differences. So it's really quite interesting that beliefs are not the major thing that changes for new Christians in the United States. They change, but that they scaled it that much lower than the others is fascinating. Especially with evangelicals, you'll see beliefs changing more, less so with mainline. What mainline Christians mark the most is they're happier than before and they're more hopeful than before. They also, their spiritual practices, they're the red block here, will change much more than anything else. I don't know why mainline Christians' actions and lifestyle don't change. At least they say that. But there you go. More hopeful is a fascinating category, and some of the things they're saying about it are interesting too. Do you participate in any other religious services or activities from other religions? We wanted to find that out as well. And it wasn't as large as we have heard. And this, I don't know whether this is our sample, but only 4% of evangelicals say that they attend some other sort of service outside of Christianity. Most of those were Jewish ceremonies. They attend a Passover Seder or something like that. Mainline Protestants, 7%. That's what you'd expect. There's much more engagement with non-Christian religions, or either going to Jewish services or doing mindfulness meditation or Buddhist practices or Zen of some sort. You find that, especially among the Episcopalians, who you already heard were a pretty large number. Now, you often hear the phrase, I'm spiritual but not religious, right? And so we tested that out too. And actually, it didn't come out very large except for the evangelicals. There were a lot of evangelicals who claimed in this blue block here to be spiritual but not religious. But mainline Christians and Catholic Orthodox Christians understand themselves to be religious, to be both spiritual and religious. And that came out pretty strikingly. Almost 60% said that they say they're both spiritual and religious, rather than claiming this, which is really pretty low. Not surprised about this one for Catholics. I would have thought that might be a little higher for mainline. I'm going to stop there. In my other two sessions, I'll do more of a traditional talk in terms of have things to say and unpack these things. But let me just stop right there and see if you have any questions. There's so much more to offer in terms of, we asked them to list what are the major obstacles in coming to faith and what are the major attractions. And those aren't quantifiable in statistics, but there's a story to be told there. And it's amazing to hear the number of evangelicals and a certain number of mainlines who left Roman Catholicism. We find a lot of people leaving Catholicism in those two traditions and complaining about it in terms of obstacles. But when you read the Roman Catholic, what attracts you to Roman Catholicism, it's the exact same things that the others don't like. So it's fascinating. A lot of people have questions about certain doctrines and beliefs that they find an obstacle. There were some crazy ones out there too, like what about aliens? What about dinosaurs? If we're all descended from Adam and Eve, doesn't that mean we're inbred? I don't understand the Trinity. I don't understand how Jesus is divine and human. Those sorts of things come up as obstacles, but they're not major ones. They are obstacles, though, and people have problems with different doctrinal traditions. I think the biggest obstacle that we saw across the board was a lack of welcome from the church, or a lack of inclusivity. Now, you find that much more among mainline traditions. I think that's why people are attracted to mainline churches, just because they're more inclusive. But I saw it in all three traditions, that one of the biggest obstacles to becoming a Christian was the lack of welcome they felt from the congregation that they were at before, or the lack of inclusivity. So, are there questions or comments or things that you think we ought to be asking and we're not? There's still time to make changes. How many different surveys we've received? So far, 376. Yeah. Our goal is to get to 500 for the Christians, and then we'll start in on the non-Christians. And we're getting it from all across the United States. We've probably sent out about 12,000 invitations to pastors to pass on the link to the survey. About 10% of pastors respond. 5% say no. Can't help you. Maybe because they don't have time, but for the vast majority of those who say they can't help me, it's because they don't have anyone in their church who meets the criteria. Someone 18 years or older who's come to faith in the last 3 years. It's in 2011. I don't know what it is, what the actual rate is, but that's what is said. And then of the other 5% who will help, of course, they pass out the surveys, and then who knows how many of those people they've actually passed them out to, but we've gotten 376, which is great, especially compared to the fact that we did all of St. Louis, Boston, and LA last year and only got like 30 surveys. So this is fantastic, and the data is rich. There's so much we're going to be able to pull out of this. Yes?
We had a question come in. What is the difference between religious and spiritual?
That's a good question. In the literature, sociologists have learned that people are more anti-religious today than they used to be. That they think of themselves as spiritual persons, as people who care about the divine, or care about morality, or care about spirituality. People are deeply spiritual, but they don't want anything to do with institutional religion. That didn't show up quite as stark as I think other sociological surveys have shown. And it's probably because our survey starts with people who are already in church. If I were to do a survey of people who understand themselves as spiritual or as people of faith in the United States without starting with the church, I would probably get to what sociologists more likely see, which is people who understand themselves as spiritual but not religious. But the fact that they're already in church means that they don't have a huge opposition to church or to religion. That's the difference. Other thoughts? Yes.
With the list of, between congregations, ministers, spouses, and we're talking about relationships, it seems like it's, to even be more specific, it's close relationships, because other people and stuff are at the bottom of that list. But my question is, what's connecting people to the congregation? I guess there's a little bit of overlap in there, but what is getting people
to get to the congregation? We ask a question that's not statistical, that we have a lot of data on, is how did you choose the congregation that you chose? What was the primary influence? Overwhelmingly, it's one of two things, really three. The top two are, this is where our family went to church, and the other one was a friend. So friends are still absolutely essential in terms of how you get to another church. A third one, which is still important, is just geography, location. This was the closest church. I'd love to know how that has changed over time, whether people still care a lot about geography or not, but we don't have any data from the past to compare that to. It's not a question that John Finney asked. So I think you're exactly right about the close relationships. And what we see about, even with the role of the minister, is that the minister develops this kind of close relationship, and that's what makes things happen. The minister somehow cares. The minister reaches out. The minister showed up. A lot of people, we ask a question about what was going on in your life Or another question, what was going on in your state of mind when you became a Christian? And so many times it's around a crisis of some sort. I lost my job, got a divorce, my mom died, my son was hospitalized. These are the top reasons why people, or what's going on in people's lives. Other times it's just simply that they were looking for more meaning. Sometimes it's they want to raise their kids in church. And so they decide to become Christians because they don't want their kids growing up outside the church. And that's another popular reason. But a minister plays a very key role in those crisis times when people are looking at making faith decisions. Okay, so for the next little while, before we take a break, we'll just leave this for table conversation. If you would just talk with those at your table about what you've heard here. Compare notes. Is this what you're seeing happening in your congregations? I'd love to get any feedback you have about the survey and where you think there are differences, even stark differences, especially between what some of the data is showing now and what you're seeing.